Genetic engineering is a process where scientists take genes from one species and force it into the DNA of other species.
Every single independent study conducted on the impact of genetically modified food shows that it damages organs, it causes infertility, it causes immune system failure, it causes holes in the GI tract, it causes multiple organ system failure.
The whole concept of genetically modified organisms is throwing a monkey wrench in the life on this planet.
What if we could produce more yield on the same amount of land, squeeze more water from a single raindrop, conserve natural resources while caring for the environment?
Monsanto is the company that told us that PCBs were safe. They told us that Agent Orange was safe. They told us that DDT was safe, and now they're in charge of telling us if their own genetically modified foods are safe.
The reason why we have 170 million acres of genetically engineered corn and soybeans and cotton and canola oil and sugar beets in the United States is because it doesn't have to be labeled.
The first genetically modified animal, a salmon, may soon be approved for human consumption.
Both these fish are 18 months old, but the larger genetically engineered Aqua Advantage salmon grows twice as fast as the regular salmon.
There has not been sufficient animal health testing, human health testing, or environmental impact testing of these new transgenic fish.
Basically, they've taken agriculture and built an industrial model which doesn't fit nature. So instead of changing their agricultural model to accommodate what is natural, they're changing nature to accommodate the industrial model. If you have an organic corn crop that sits next to a genetically engineered corn field, and it happens to tassel at the same time, and it happens to be downwind, you're going to get your crop contaminated.
The rest of the food supply is contaminated. Then the genie's out of the bottle, and it's maybe physically impossible to turn the situation around.
In the genetic engineering revolution, these seeds are now patented property of one corporation called Monsanto.
The pharmaceutical industry has no interest in having you well because they don't make any money if you're well. And the pharmaceutical industry is the biotech industry.
Some people think that GMO really means God move over.
We are heading downhill at a rapid rate of speed toward our own extinction.
The use of GM in agriculture is a risk that is simply not worth taking.
In the mid-90s, the UK government gave about $3 million to a scientist to figure out how to test for the safety of GMOs. That scientist was Dr. Arpad Pusztai, the world's leading expert in his field. He worked at the top nutritional research laboratory in the UK, one of the best in the world. He had about 20 or 30 researchers working with him in 3 different institutes, and his protocols that he was designing were supposed to be implemented into EU law as requirements for the safety assessments of any GMOs to be introduced into Europe. He took a potato that was genetically engineered to produce an insecticide and fed one group of rats the genetically engineered potato. He fed another group of rats natural potatoes, and a third group of rats natural potatoes, plus their meal was spiked with the same insecticide that the GM potato was engineered to produce. So you have GM potato, and natural potato, plus an insecticide, and all 3 had a completed balanced diet as well.
We measured all sorts of things, growth, for example, how these young animals were growing, what happened to their inside, and what happened to their immune system. And it became clear that the GM had a slower growth. It had problems with internal development of its organs, and it certainly knocked out the immune system.
Only the rats that ate the GM potato got sick. They had potentially precancerous cell growth in their digestive tract, smaller brains, livers, and testicles, partial atrophy of the liver, damaged immune system in 10 days. What was the cause of that damage? It was not the insecticide, because the group eating the insecticide did not have the problem. It was understood that it was the process of genetic engineering itself and the unpredicted side effects that caused this profound damage to every system and organ study. A death rate that's 5 times that compared to controls. Sterile babies, even babies with hair growing in their mouths. And this has been done by government scientists as well as independent scientists who are at the top of their field.
Pay close attention to what you are about to see. These rats have been fed with transgenic corn during their entire life cycle. The tumors they suffer from are enormous. The study that revealed the effect of the GMOs on the health of these rats has just been completed. It lasted for 2 years.
We spent over a year trying to obtain transgenic corn because no GMO manufacturers were willing to provide them. This is because Monsanto requires contracts to be signed stipulating that the seeds must not be used for testing. We wanted our study to be independent.
Every rat was dissected to identify the way each diet, GMO, GMO and Roundup, and Roundup on its own, had acted on the metabolism of each animal, focusing on the development rate of the tumors that only start to manifest themselves after the initial 3-month period.
Each step up represents a large tumor, which can measure 17 millimeters by 17 millimeters. 94% of them take effect in the mammary glands, which would equate to breast cancer in a woman. We are faced with renal tumors for the males. Some males also suffer from mammary tumors.
One could have thought that the main cause of death was coming from the pesticide added to the corn. But what the study highlighted, and this for the first time ever, is the fact that the transgenesis itself could have killed the rats. What this means is that just by interfering with the genome of the plant in order to modify it, we are faced with repercussions that no one could have anticipated. This is enough to make us reconsider all the scientific precepts that led to the creation of GMOs.
We realized that GMOs without any Roundup residue were responsible for an increase in the death rate of females and of some males. This is the GMO that is being eaten by the Americans, but also the GMO that has been approved for importation by European agencies, and that contaminates our food.
When they allow animals to graze on the cotton plants after harvest in India, for years and years there was no problem. When they introduced this Bt toxin producing cotton, thousands of sheep died, buffalo died, goats died. I've interviewed the people myself, seen pictures of their dead animals. These animals were successfully grazing on non-Bt cotton plants for years. In one case, 13 buffalo grazed on Bt cotton plants for a single day, and within 3 days they were all dead. Unfortunately, there is not sufficient follow-up. One small non-governmental organization pleaded with the government in India, please do some research on these animals. The government refused. They pleaded with universities offering to pay for the research themselves. They refused. So this small NGO did their own research. They put 3 sheep in one field with Bt cotton Bolgard 1, 3 with Bolgard 2, and 3 with non-GM cotton. Within a month, all 6 sheep eating the Bt cotton plants died. But 3 eating the non-Bt cotton plants have no symptoms. But their research was dismissed because it wasn't a government agency or a university. So we have a situation where the evidence is there, but it's not being paid attention to because it's being drowned out by the big bucks and the biotech industry with their tobacco-type science and their distortion and denial of the facts.
Unfortunately, Monsanto's lobbying power and their financial weight, they are able to use corrupted corporate science, something that I call cigarette science, to get these products slipped into our food stream.
The only human feeding study ever published on GMOs showed that the gene that was inserted into the soybean transferred into the DNA of the bacteria living inside our intestines and continued to produce that protein. So if it happens to be an allergen and you're allergic to it, you may be continuously triggered over and over again by the production of that allergen from within inside your own intestines. When we look at the quality of the nutrients in our soil, we see that that has become actually a victim of industrial agriculture, which destroys the microorganisms in the soil and then puts in a few nutrients as if that were enough to provide a healthy diet. It turns out that the current industrial agricultural model was based on surplus military products after World War II. They had extra bomb-making material that worked as fertilizer, so they created the synthetic fertilizer industry. They had excess nerve gas that they could use as insecticides, so they created an insecticidal industry. And by steering the farmers and the land-grant universities and all the population towards these high-input, corporate-driven agricultural models, we actually stripped away some of the health and some of the nutrients that were vital and are vital to the health of the people and of the livestock.
Welcome to this edition of Meet America. I'm hoping that those of you who have seen what this documentary is revealing will contact your ag commissioner here in Monterey County. You can look him up on the internet. Just type in Google Ag Commissioner of Monterey and all his information will come up. Because that one person can destroy and is destroying our produce here in Monterey County with allowing GMOs, genetically modified organisms, to proliferate and contaminate our organic and commercial industries here. Tell our Ag Commissioner not to allow GMOs in Monterey County. Call Bob Roach, the Agricultural Commissioner's assistant, at that number and voice your concern that you want a moratorium. In 2008, I and several other people spearheaded a movement to ask the Board of Supervisors to vote for a GMO moratorium based on Santa Cruz moratorium on GMOs. And the Farm Bureau that is pushing GMOs to and making farmers feel very, very pressured into using GMOs was against this moratorium, and they're very, very powerful. And in my opinion, they are a very dark force upon our farming industry as a result of their opinions and their political stance of pushing GMOs. So you can call the Farm Bureau there, that's the headquarters, and tell them to stop corrupting our food with GMOs. This is so very vital and so very, very important if we're going to stop this. You need to also call the Monterey Board of Supervisors to vote for a GM moratorium on GMO crops. And that is very, very important. And particularly important is the organic farmers do that, because they're not allowed to have genetically modified organisms in their produce. And Monsanto has many, many octopus arms. The Ag Commissioner Eric Lorenz told the Monterey Board of Supervisors in 2008 not to implement the GMO moratorium because they felt that there wasn't any real, how do you say, viable science that proved that GMOs were harmful. Ignoring the 41,000-page document the FDA scientists themselves came out with in 1991, advocating and stating that it was very clear to them that genetically modified organisms should not be allowed into the open environment and that they needed to be tested for at least 2 decades. But Mr. Lawrence ignored this. Why did he ignore it? Because he's part of the government, and the government is ruled by the FDA. Now, who is the Deputy Commissioner to the FDA? It is the former Vice President of Monsanto himself, Mike Taylor. So Mike Taylor ignored the 41,000-page document put out by the FDA scientist advising against GMOs. And as a result, the USDA, which is under the FDA, must push and regulate and allow for the release of these organisms. And thus, our government is killing us. These corporations, such as Monsanto, are invested heavily with pharmaceutical. The pharmaceutical is biotech, and they all invest in each other, and they all make money for each other, and so a sick consumer is good money for them. So they really have no interest, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many, many other independent scientists and concerned people, that they have no interest in our health. So if you want to continue allowing these corporations to kill you and your children slowly, a soft kill, then just sit on your couches and do nothing. But this will affect you one way or the other. And one way or the other, if you don't have the energy to call the supervisors and the ag commissioner and do the things that you need to do, then you will be called upon to go to the doctor and find out why you and your loved ones have breast cancer, prostate cancer, colitis, sudden death syndrome, of which we are going to hear about in just a moment from the prominent and wonderful independent Dr. Huber from Purdue University, who studied GMOs and their effects on our bodies and our guts for the last 15 years. And he had the courage to stand up against the system and tell it like it is. So I want to thank you so much for watching. And please do your part and call the Farm Bureau, tell them to stop corrupting our food. The Farm Bureau is pushing farmers to go GMO, and call the Ag Commissioner and his assistant at that number and tell them that they need to advise the supervisors and put on the agenda to vote for a GMO moratorium in Monterey County. This is urgent. This is an emergency. Monsanto has a seed company in Monterey County, and there is no record of what farmer has bought what GMOs or where he's growing them and what fields he's already contaminating. So please, do your part. Thank you.
Hi, this is Dr. Mercola, and today I'm joined by Dr. Don Huber, who is an expert in an area of science that relates to GMOs, and it's going to help us understand some of the nasty insider tricks of what's going on with this GMO issue. And he's actually gotten quite a bit of notoriety for his expertise in this area. So welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Dr. Mercola.
I wonder if you can tell our viewers what your specific training is and how you came to attain this knowledge and information on this very specific area of GMO toxicity.
My area of training is soil-borne diseases, microbial ecology, and host-parasite relationships, so that in realizing that agriculture is a system, not just a bunch of little blocks that fit together, you have to understand how that system works and realize that any time we change one part of that system, we really change the interaction of all of those other components as they work together. And so each time we have a change, whether it's crop rotation or tillage or different fertility programs or herbicide interactions, we see those changes as they affect those components in the system. And so my research over the last 55 years has been devoted to looking at those changes and how we can change them and manage that system for more effective crop production, better disease control, and improved nutrition and safety of our food crops. So when we look at such a major change as you have in a genetic disruption from a genetically engineered process, as we understand it in our limited knowledge now, we see that there are opportunities and actual changes in all of those components as they fit into the agricultural system, from the plant, the physical environment, the dynamics of the biological environment, and of course our pests and diseases as they interact together. So those have been the areas of my research over time and brought me to this point.
So most of the information you're sharing is relatively new and not widely known at all. So as a result, the public appreciation of this toxicity of glyphosate is really limited. So I'm wondering if you can help us, the people viewing this, put it in a proper perspective and perhaps relate its toxicity from your understanding as a professional research scientist to one that they might be familiar with, which is DDT. Because in many ways it's similar with reproductive problems and inhibiting, many of the reproductive functions. So if you could maybe just help us understand it from that perspective.
There are some similarities. I'm not, again, qualified in a lot of those aspects, but familiar with DDT, the fact that very difficult compound to degrade, is biologically degraded, primarily by a process we call co-metabolism. In other words, there are very few organisms that can utilize it as a direct nutrient source. And there are a few organisms that can utilize glyphosate as a direct nutrient source. But again, most of the degradation appears to be by co-metabolism. In other words, an organism just happens to produce the extracellular enzymes that will degrade it, rather than the organism really getting any benefit from it. So there's not that stimulus in that process.
Does ultraviolet light break it down, like sunlight?
I don't know.
Okay.
Again, I haven't followed a lot of those areas.
Okay.
But we know that it can accumulate for, in some situations, a very short period of time. In other situations, it can persist for years. That'll be primarily determined by biological activity, but also by the soil pH and clay content, how firmly it's sequestered in the soil or absorbed in the soil. So the less movement of the chelated glyphosate into the clay structure in the soil, the more readily it would be available for degradation by microorganisms. So once it gets moved in, probably not really accessible for degradation, but then can be desorbed chemically. The organisms that are stimulated are the pathogens. And just as this paper that I was reviewing and of the presentation that was made at the meetings in Germany 2 weeks ago shows is that Clostridium, for instance, is very tolerant at extremely high rates of glyphosate, but all of the natural biological control organisms are very sensitive relative to that concentration for the glyphosate. What we see with the Fusaria that cause sudden death syndrome on soybeans is that it can be stimulated by the glyphosate. It's not a real rapid degrader, but it can utilize it. But it is stimulated, so we find a 500% increase in root colonization by this fungus. Very serious pathogen, not only on soybeans, but Fusaria on most of our crops is a major disease organism we have to deal with. But Dr. Kremer and others have shown up to a 500% increase in root colonization, even on the Roundup Ready crops, because again, there's nothing in that technology that does anything to the glyphosate. All it does is make it possible for that plant to survive and to accumulate more glyphosate, so that we still change the soil ecology, the microbial ecology, and as this paper from Germany is showing, our intestinal microbiology. Because, again, those organisms are very sensitive to glyphosate because they have the shikimate pathway in them.
So this glyphosate is being used as a weed killer, classic weed killer, herbicide. But from what you said, it actually serves as a fertilizer for some pathogenic bacteria. It makes the bad bacteria grow more, and it kills the good bacteria. Very similar to what in some ways what an antibiotic would do.
Yeah, be the same type of a relationship, so that it's not always a matter of whether an organism is present or absent in the soil, whether it's going to cause the disease. It's a matter of what that biological balance is that normally keeps it in check. And when you take one side of that balance out, then it's a matter of just having free rein for the disease organism. But with glyphosate, we also see an additional stimulation of virulence, so that we see that increased ability to cause disease, as well as the loss of the natural biological controls.
Now, I'm going to pose you a little difficult question here, just as out of personal curiosity, but I suspect many others would be interested. Virtually no one I know would like to be hit with either a baseball bat or a hammer. So there is no good answer. But if you had your choice, and you had to use one of these toxins, DDT or glyphosate, from what you understand of both, what would you use?
Oh, there's no question. I would take DDT.
DDT. That's what I was. I mean, you say that very unequivocally.
Yeah. Well, I know of both, and I looked at the Triana, Alabama studies and other studies with DDT. I was in a position to look at that. Again, a lot of these materials can have a very beneficial use. And I'm certainly not anti-chemical. But we have to use some common sense. What we have with glyphosate is the most abused chemical we've ever had in the history of man.
God, that's a very profound statement.
When you look at the millions of pounds that are applied, at the broad spectrum effects that it has on the ecology, on our ecology that we're dependent on for subsistence, and then we don't pay any attention at all to the fact that there's a purpose and there's an abuse, and we're on a rampant abuse. And when we've gone with the genetic engineered products that permit us to apply more and more of the compound, the abuse is accelerated with the limited knowledge that we have. And I can tell you, when future historians write about our time, they're not going to write about the tons of chemical that we did or didn't apply. When it comes to glyphosate, they're going to write about our willingness to sacrifice our children and to jeopardize our existence by threatening and jeopardizing the very basis of our existence and that sustainability of our agriculture.
It's such a massively profound statement. I mean, and it just resonates with truth. I totally believe what you said. God. So,
it doesn't mean that it's not reversible.
Yeah, I know, but it's just...
But it means that we need to recognize what the concerns are, what's happening, and then we need to change. As a scientist, when we get into this situation, you see a disease that's a very wimpy disease like Goss's wilt for 30 years since it was known has been very localized, very limited in its ability to cause damage. And all of a sudden you see the thing essentially throughout all of our production areas as a major factor reducing the quality and the quantity of the food that we need for our population or for the world's population. And we're doing everything that we can to make it more difficult to produce that quality and that quantity of food in the things that we're doing. And you have to say, well, what's changed? And as a scientist, we do that all the time. We look at correlations. We look at other things. We try and figure out what that key point is that's changed. And what we see is the key point is in these products that we've moved with without having the basic understanding of what they're doing, and then have a massive experience based on flawed science and failed promises just to support the bottom line of a few large companies.
And just maybe if you can comment on the fact that this seems to be accelerating. It's not getting better, it's getting worse, because not only do we have the introduction of new crops that are genetically resistant to glyphosate, but the glyphosate itself, the main purpose is an herbicide. So it's preventing the weeds, but the weeds are becoming resistant. So they have super weeds, so they not only have to apply more glyphosate, but they're applying other herbicides. So I wonder if you can comment on that, and perhaps as an extension of that, the rate at which you see the acceleration of the use and how much more of these toxic chemicals are being spread.
Well, you have to realize, start with, that glyphosate doesn't kill the weeds directly. Now, if you apply enough of it, you can. What we see with the resistant weeds is they're resistant to the pathogens because glyphosate, again, as a chelator, just gives the plant a bad case of AIDS. It doesn't kill it directly. It's these soil-borne pathogens that kill it. So glyphosate turns off the immune system in the plant. As an analogy, it's not quite the same as in an animal, but it turns off those natural defense mechanisms so that the plant becomes very susceptible then to these soil-borne pathogens that are always there. When we have a resistant plant, we've selected them for resistance to that pathogen. And when we add more glyphosate that finally kills it because we can finally suppress the defenses in that plant, then we have also stimulated the pathogen, but we've also drastically altered that microflora from a beneficial standpoint that we rely on for sustainability of our agriculture. And so we've destroyed the natural biological controls. We've impaired the ability of the plant to obtain nutrients for the health of the soil, and we've stimulated our disease organisms in that whole process. We've never once considered a judicial use. You can go in and you can look at the advertising, and it's said it's very effective on cracks in your concrete driveway or your garden or the rest of the world. We've never considered any common sense that we used to use in the registration of most of our pesticides and say, how quick will it be degraded, under what conditions, what does it, what are the degradation products, what's the overall impact on the environment and the safety. We used to do those things almost as a natural process in evaluation. We don't do that anymore. We've given glyphosate pretty much a pass on any of those considerations because, quote unquote, it was considered safe. The other thing is with genetic engineering. Whoever came up with the term I know who did, but how they came up with the term is substantially equivalent. Can't understand. There's nothing substantially equivalent about genetic engineering and the normal sexual breeding process. And Patrick Brown, Dr. Brown at the University of California, stated it very well in his document in 2000 when he said that it's more like a virus infection than it is normal sexual breeding program, where you're inserting a gene just like a virus does. In fact, we even have to have virus protein genes and a number of other things to get it to express itself, so that you don't have the normal controls and regulatory genetics that go along with that natural sexual process and the genetic engineering that we would normally have to keep all of those things in balance and in a controlled state.
So it sounds like one of the foundational elements that allowed the problem to get to the point where it is today is this underlying assumption of the safety of glyphosate. So can you comment on how it was perceived to be safe? I mean, this seems a ludicrous assumption, yet it's the working basis of modern agriculture, it seems.
Well, part of it was a failure to understand what the product is, and that's as a strong chelator. They only looked for what the mechanism was by which it killed plants. And that took some time. It wasn't easy to find and to identify the EPSPS enzyme as the inhibitor, because it inhibited a lot of other enzymes also. It's not just a single target type event. And as I read some of the early documents that stated, it inhibits the EPSPS enzyme, actual herbicidal mode of action unknown. Well, in 1984, it was very well documented that the way it kills weeds and plants is by compromising the defense mechanisms and making them very susceptible to these soil-borne organisms. In sterile soil, it doesn't kill. It will stunt because it's a growth regulator. It suppresses that defense mechanism that also produces lignin and a lot of other metabolites, secondary metabolites and hormones, but doesn't kill. Most of our herbicides attack a primary mechanism, so that when you shut that enzyme down, then you get cell death or death of the plant. With glyphosate, it isn't. It's a debilitating type of a situation, more like AIDS than it is a direct killer. So there wasn't a clear-cut direct mechanism that was obvious in its use. And it also, since humans and animals don't have this shikimate pathway, it was assumed that this is a pathway that's only in plants and microorganisms, therefore it's going to be safe for us. It was also assumed that the foreign proteins, whether it's BT or whether it's the protein from glyphosate, that new EPSPS gene from the agrobacterium, it was assumed that they would be readily degraded in the gut, and you can put them in a little beaker with hydrochloric acid, and you can show that, they probably denature. That's different, though, than what you have in your stomach or in your intestines, and it's a flawed science. We don't really understand even what that genetic functional genetics are with the normal sexual breeding program, leave alone when it's disrupted by inserting a foreign one. We know that when we insert a foreign gene, we disrupt all kinds of things in the process. It's not just a simple matter of shooting a silver bullet and it does the job. When you change anything in agriculture or in the system, you change a lot of other things. And typically, going back to the question on herbicides, when we would apply an herbicide, we would tell our growers, you rotate the chemistry, just like you rotate the crop. And therefore, when you had an effect on a specific group of organisms, you had an opportunity for that nature to rebalance and to reestablish that beneficial and functional relationship. We haven't done that with glyphosate. We've just continually hammered for over 30 years in one direction on those beneficial organisms, so that, again, as I indicated earlier, they no longer exist in the environment. We see that we have to start adding them now in order to maintain crop productivity and nutritional value.
So glyphosate existed prior to the introduction of genetically modified crops?
Yes, it was introduced in 1984.
About 10 years before.
So,
it would make sense because...
Excuse me, in 1974.
Yeah, so they would have to have time to utilize it and understand and do the science to get the crops to be introduced. So I'm wondering if you could comment on your perception of the increased use of glyphosate. I mean, is it doubling every few years, or do you have any?
Well, in 2007, USDA asked for permission not to have to record how much use. It was going up so rapidly that it was embarrassing, I think, for anybody to realize how much of this organic phosphate was being put out, or phosphite, which is even has a different chemical category than the phosphates that we have, but it's embarrassing to see how much of it is being applied, and especially when now we can see all of these other side effects from a direct effect on beneficial microorganisms. We're seeing the effect on organisms in the intestinal tract just from the residue in food and feed. So that, and yet we still recently had the FDA increasing residue levels that were permitted in some of our food crops. Reduced it in meat, so that I think it went from 3 parts per million down to 1/10. Didn't give any explanation for that. I'm not aware of any toxicology data. But why would you reduce it in the meat if you are going to increase it in your feed and food going into the animal or into our food chain?
So the potential implications of the long-term consequence to this, you alluded to earlier. But I wonder if you could do a worst-case scenario and then integrate within your answer any potential remediation efforts. And what are worst-case scenarios? I mean, are we going to reach some type of critical threshold, at which point it becomes, there's really no way to remediate against this thing? We're looking at the extinction of large numbers of the animal species, and even maybe the extinction of our species. I'm just, what's the worst-case scenario in your projection?
I usually don't deal in worst-case scenarios because I'm more of an optimist.
Yeah.
And 20 years of my research was designed, how do we remediate for the downside of glyphosate as far as that nutrient availability and the disease predisposition. And so I really focus very heavily on that area. I don't think that you have to go very far, though, to realize that if we continue in the same direction, that we're going to see the same effect or even a greater effect, because in health, just like in plant diseases, we usually recognize it only after there's been a lag period. And when we recognize that we're only at a small part of that overall lag period, we only see a small part of the iceberg. And I think that's where we are now, where we're just starting to see the full impact, not the full impact, but the impact on reproductive fertility and also the disease potential, because our diseases, plant diseases, are continue to increase. Our animal diseases. You look at, you can't hardly pick up the paper anymore without seeing a human disease that's involved. USA Today in today's paper mentions the salmonella outbreaks. Well, we recall 20% of our total egg production here last year, early this year, because of salmonella. You have to say, well, what's changed? Newspaper said when they looked at the egg-producing facilities, they had chicken manure and they had rodent droppings. Now, my kids growing up always had 200 or 300 chickens as a 4-H project. Never seen a chicken that didn't have have manure. And anytime you have feed, even with 3 or 4 cats around and whatnot, you're going to have some rodents. That's not the reason. I think with the data that is shown from this German paper now with the Clostridium, showing that it's a problem, and it also shows that E. coli and some of these other organisms have a very high tolerance for glyphosate compared to the natural biological controls, that it may not be the salmonella's presence or absence that maintains our food security and safety, but the presence or absence of these natural biological control organisms, because salmonella and Clostridium and a lot of these disease organisms are ubiquitous. They're everywhere. Our health is dependent on keeping them in check. Well, if we're eliminating that check, either through food residues in our food or through direct impact in the environment, we're going to continue to see what we're seeing today. And you look at Alzheimer's and thyroid problems and autism and Parkinson's, any of those diseases that have a tie with either the endocrine system or the nutrient availability, we're going to see those increase. Looked at 6 weeks ago, I was in Australia and had an opportunity to review a study that's ongoing there. It's a takeoff from a study or a continuation of a study that was conducted in Iowa with pigs and cattle. And they're doing it with mice so that they can define what the toxicants are, natural toxicants in the genetically engineered crops. But they're using these 1 pound or 2 pound big white rats that some people like to call them a pet. My wife would like to hit them with a broom if she saw them, but you can reach into the non-GMO fed rats and pull it out, put it on your lap, and it can be petted just like a cat. You try and reach into the cage where the rats are being fed the genetically engineered feed, and here they've limited just specifically to one. The rats are irritated. They don't get along together. They're always go off into their own little world on it. They do backflips as they crawl up on run the cage. Can't get any peace, can't settle down. We see all of that increase, very typical of what you'd see with autism. And then you start looking and you say, well, are there any other similarities? Well, when I was in Germany here 2 weeks ago, I had a doctor that specializes in working with children with autism. And I mentioned the study in Iowa where they had compared GMO and non-GMO, and You look at the stomachs of the GMO, they have all of the severe allergy responses, that inflammation and the reddening. But then when they looked at the intestine, they said that the intestinal lining is all deteriorating. Not the same. The smell of the intestinal contents is very rank. The biology has been drastically changed. And this doctor said, well, that's exactly what we're seeing with our children with autism. Now, you need some research, but certainly the indicators are there, and the research up until very recently hasn't been done, and those who wanted to do it have been prohibited from publishing or from doing the research. We see those that dared to come out and raise some concerns that have been very severely impacted professionally, as well as in their own personal lives, and that persecution that they've had to endure. And we've got to change. We've got to recognize that what we have now isn't normal. We've got to get back to a safe and a sufficient and sustainable production and health for our agricultural community if we're going to be healthy in that process also.
Couldn't agree more. You mentioned that you did work for the last 20 years on remediation efforts, and I'm wondering if you could comment on how one would remediate against this deluge of glyphosate that's been introduced into our environment.
Of course, one of the important things, again, is just understanding what glyphosate is as a strong chelator to immobilize nutrients. And so one of the things that we see is that if we'll compensate for that, either the effect of the gene, if you're using a Roundup Ready, or the effect of the gene and the chemistry, the glyphosate, if you're using both of them, or if you're just using the glyphosate, how do we compensate for that reduced availability? And we can do that in plants with foliar applications of our micronutrients. Usually it takes 8 to 10 days after the glyphosate is applied before you'll have any benefit from a foliar application of manganese or zinc or copper or that, because the glyphosate is still very active in that plant and will still chelate and immobilize it so that it's not beneficial. It may be in the plant, and when you do a soil or a tissue test, it'll say, I'm in full sufficiency, but when you actually look at the plant, we're seeing deficiency of manganese, for instance, at levels that are twice as high as we used to consider fully sufficient physiologically. But we can add those, we can compensate. Now, a lot of the sources of our nutrients aren't all equal in their beneficial effect on that physiologic process, because they're not all soluble or translocated across the membranes or even mobile in the plant enough to fully compensate for it, especially with a mineral like manganese that doesn't move downward in a plant, it only moves upward. And so we need to look at those techniques so that we can meet the full plant sufficiency. When we do, we can compensate. We restore the disease resistance, and we again have nutritious and healthy food that can be produced. Without doing that, then we see that very marked reduction in nutritional value even when the quantity is produced. But often we see, as we're seeing now with SDS and with Goss's wilt and with Fusarium head scab and the mycotoxins in our cereals, that we can't compensate for all of those effects because of the dynamics of that soil biology, unless we also address that. That's a more difficult one. Most of the products that I've evaluated over the years to beef up the soil biology, most of those organisms are very sensitive to glyphosate. So that even when we add them, We have to wait until the glyphosate is very firmly chelated in the soil, or else we have a toxic entity that totals what we're trying to do. If we do that, and we're having to do it now on a regular basis for our legumes, we have to add the inoculum. Well, for years we haven't had to, because the organisms, nitrogen-fixing organisms, were able to establish in the soil and develop in that environment, so that all we had to do was plant the seed. Now, since 30 years of glyphosate has taken them out of that environment or reduced their efficiency, now we have to add them again. And so we can do that, but before you do anything, you have to recognize that there's a problem. And this one has kind of snuck up on us. It's, I guess if you wanted to put it with the old Greek mythology, you'd say it's a Trojan killer. Mm-hmm. Because it's slow, it's an indirect effect. It's not direct in those end effects that we're observing. And so you have to go back and look at the correlations and look at where the ties are to get back at the cause. And that's much like the veterinarians did with this new entity, that they, first place after they established that was the cause of the reproductive failure, they went to the feed and said, well, where's this thing coming from? And that's when they found the soybean meal had high concentrations. We find it in that the fusarium, the fungus that causes sudden death syndrome, can carry that into the plant. And in the plant, it multiplies, grows very well. If it's a living entity, it reproduces anyway. Again, we're not sure how to classify it or where to put it there at this point. Working very hard to get that name. But again, the veterinarians, that's where they found it. We find that it very synergistic with most other organisms in the environment. And at some point in time or in some situation, it may have a beneficial role, just like a lot of other organisms do. But in the environment that we're putting it in or that we're creating, it's an extremely detrimental entity for us to have to deal with. If it's not a living entity, DNA sequencing should tell us that, then it raises another question of what do you do? How do you reverse it? Again, it's new to